Right, so part two of this short little mini-series, if you will. You see, for those who haven't quite seen exactly what the situation was, is that yesterday I was deeply suspicious about a job proposition about being what they called a champion of masculinity, and my criticisms is that this appeared to be a job that severely seemed to be understating, if you will, just sort of the problems they seem to be highlighting, from social stigmata, alienation and whatnot. Now they claim, among many other things, that it was supposed to be aimed specifically between young people between the ages of 18 and 30. I, however, have a smaller issue with this. Is because, just to give you guys a bit of an example, in order to really access the sort of problems that they seem to want to address, I would say, insofar as I'm concerned, I would have to go as far back as I'll have to go back as far as my own history in terms of when I became sort of a little bit aware of certain changes. Not just on the outside, but also on the inside. So, in order to do that, it would probably be about the time when I started puberty. So, we're talking about 2009, when I was about 11 years old, just about finished to a primary school. And maybe we should start it with something like that, because what I feel like possibly... even in this day and age, it would be so incredibly easy for us to look at this whole situation and just say to ourselves, well, you know what? Because of the rise of social media and the shocking ages in which younger and younger people are accessing social media, thereby also having access to the internet and also having access to many of, the crueler sides of reality as far as we're going to be concerned. You know what? A lot of people made a lot of noise when they complained about the changes to UK laws in regards to the access of adult-related content on the internet. However, we can't deny there was a very specific point to all of this. A point, very specifically, that quite a lot of people seem to have ignored. And without wanting to necessarily touch upon it, because it's incredibly distressing and very, very upsetting, you probably may know what it is, but let's just put it like this. If that happened to my daughter or my son, I would have a very, very, very different opinion about it. Because that's the okay, so when I was about... when I was starting to go through puberty, and of course it's when physically you start to grow at an exponential rate. You start to just learn things about the opposite sex. Sex education, actually, to be honest, is it's such a widely fascinating point of contention, especially when I was learning about it in my stage of life. It's not because you needed to know about the way your body functioned and about the mechanics and the how exactly sperm is produced in your testicles and whatnot, and everything, without going into graphic detail. It would be easy to say, okay, so we know about it, but even at whether you're 12 or possibly 18, sometimes it can be very, or even as old as 30, for example. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to gauge, or rather understate, if you will, how important it is to know these things, because it's not just knowing about how your body functions, but it's also understanding how it changes, how it interacts with other people, and more often than not, people have found ways to exploit the way people are attracted. There's loads of articles that I ironically filled out. These are the sorts of things like talk to the press and whatnot, because They seem to lay the door for like a lot of vulnerable men. They seem to lay the door at pornography as being a key distributor of exploitation, alien, and it sort of exasperates this idea of social alienation, stigmata against men. But then again, the press, and you this goes back decades and decades, but then again, the press has always been very, very keen at laying the blame at things like porn, or when it came to violence, things like the Grand Theft Auto series. The reason why they do stuff like that is because it's a scapegoat in their eyes. And they think that somehow it solves things, that we could say, porn is, the cause and effect for a lot of men's, inadequacies in terms of getting into realistic relationships and their warped perceptions about how women interact with them, and including attitudes towards how we interact with women as well. Nothing could be further from the truth. If there's one thing that, honestly, these sorts of articles do touch upon that is actually slightly truthful, is the idea possibly that, well, there's probably damn good reasons as to why, alienation sort of exists, included with a lot of young people, because, quite frankly, this is the age that's being created for them. It's an age in which we can talk to people whenever we want, wherever we want. We don't even have to talk to them face to face. We've created a world that's very, very convenient, but unfortunately, there are problems out there in this world that are nowhere near as convenient, and you can't just solve and just say, you know what, there we are, that's one problem sorted. We can't just solve problems because they ironically they create more they in trying to solve things, we've over-engineered and severely underestimated, the repercussions, or rather the side effects that things like, instant messaging and having access to anything in the world causes. Because if everybody knows everything about everyone else, and we don't have to go too far to spread the message, then what's the point of things being kept private? Of course, there's a very sincere and very honest point about keeping things private. However, there's going to be people who will exploit this. There's going to be people out there who will prize upon people who do not know any different, and especially, I would say possibly when you leave school, whether it's the age of 16 or 18, and you become part of a completely different world. Because what so many of us grow to realize, if you will, is that when you're in school, you have a structure, you have a timetable, you have lessons you got to do, you have homework, you have times for recreation, you have times for lunch. Everything is organized and everything is neatly compacted, because it's very, very important for children to have structure. Because you know what, it's sort of the way we've formulated a functioning and well adapted society, because we understand how important it is to make the use of our time. And outside of things like time management, it's also about what you do within these hours. That's not to say, not everybody who does badly in school doesn't achieve anything because they have a lack of focus or a lack of direction. You'll be surprised when you come into contact with the outside world, in any capacity, how much your ideas are thrown out of kilter. Because it's only when you actually make contact with the outside world do your ideas, your ways of thinking, yourself, your personality, it's when a very, very brazen mirror gets shone directly at you. Suddenly, people start to see your ideas, whatever they may be, for what they are. And they come to some sort of bizarre conclusion that is everything they need to know about you, and we don't need to waste any more time knowing anything else. Possibly that's the reason why, among many other things, we say, you know what, and tell me if you guys ever heard this before, that transgender males, they're just mentally ill men, and therefore there we are. They're just mentally ill. It's the same attitude they have towards this. They just say that that's that, and therefore that is one problem sorted. Yeah, just saying somebody is mentally ill, that's a way of solving a problem. I don't think so. And regardless of what your position, your attitude towards transgender people or gay people, whatever it may be, there is an awful lot to be said about the attitude of just, well, we rubber stamp them. It's a rubber stamp mentality. It's exactly as it says. We deem them mentally unwell. We deem them poor. We deem them, unclean. We deem them as illegal. We deem them as migrants. We deem them as Muslims. We deem them as Christians, Jews. It goes on and on and on. And this way of thinking even affects people who absolutely should know better than not to do stuff like that, because if somebody rubber stamped me as being poor and therefore I can't be anything else except poor, no, who in their right mind is ever going to start listening to me ever again? Because why on earth would you listen to somebody who is poor? Now, you out there might possibly do that. However, it's do you think I would walk around if they could find a way for me to walk around with poor stamped on my forehead? They probably would. I'm not saying it's a good thing. In fact, but unfortunately, that's the sort of world we create. We create more in this attempt to actually make things easier. We've made it more difficult to shake certain things, and whether it's through the things we say and through the things we do. And this isn't necessarily hindered just to men. Women also find a lot of pressure that they face, and to be honest, insofar as my observation is concerned, some of the things that women are subjected to is probably far, far worse than what I can possibly state. Case in point, sexual misconduct. Do you have any idea the amount of female YouTubers and even the sort of women I work with? Do you know how many times people point, giggle, say things behind their backs about how they look, their hair, how tall they are, how big they are and stuff like that? That honestly, it's sad. Again, sadly, this just happens, and I would say in scenarios like that, you could either just, well, actually, to be honest, I have no... It's not that I would not know how to deal with that, because, well, to do that, I would actually have to be a woman to honestly know what it feels like. Something I have no experience in. But then, at the same time, I understand fine well it's not a nice thing. So, of course, having that sense of empathy, it goes a long way, and I'm sure this is the sort of thing we all understand, and the sort of things we all know. However, in saying that, it has also probably uncovered a shocking side in terms of... how we talked a little bit about social media, and we also talked about, the way people will try and say things because they do it with malicious intent. And the reason why I say malicious intent is because it's said by the sort of people who know fine well that it's not a good thing to do. And guess what? As long as they can get away with it, that is literally all that matters. But then again, that this is a sort of... it seems to be... this so much about, even just in this day and age of 2025... we seem to be almost living in an age where the phrase or the word civility almost seems to have been completely ripped out of the dictionary. AKA, we can actually learn to get along with each other. We may not like each other, but we may not dislike each other either. We might be completely neutral towards each other, but the point is that we recognise that everybody has got their own places to be, they've got their own things to do, they've got their own agendas, they just want to get on with it and just get on with the world and get on with the things they do. But this also seems to be one of those things where it's almost downright impossible, to be honest, to for this sort of thing to come about, because you will see this everywhere you go, and I could say this towards the sort of people we want to be aiming at, is that even for the people who haven't had any like direct exposure or any sort of relevant tell me if you guys out there have ever seen videos like by the likes of Billy Moore or Charlie Veach or DJ Media or My Breaks Don't Work, and how more often than not you will see people who literally they try and kick off with these YouTubers for no other reason than they think they can win, despite the fact that a lot of the people who do that, they are completely on the right side of the law. They don't present, any sort of issues towards people. And before you know it, they start becoming targets because all they've done is, well, humiliated themselves in front of possibly hundreds of thousands of people. And they still think that they're large enough and big enough to start taking on people for some reason they think that it's just they can do it because you know what I'm trying to say. They act clever and they try and act big, but unfortunately they're not, because the reality is that if you know fine well what you're doing is wrong, and you know fine well you know based on past experience these sorts of things don't ever end well, what's the point in trying to humiliate yourself and trying to what's the point to any of this? It's not the sort of thing that I would say 100% fits into an argument like this. However, and we're sort of going to like tie this a little bit towards the end of this discussion, is that these are sorts of people that are out there, and probably, you know what, they're probably vulnerable as well, and maybe they have just had a really, really bad day, and the only thing that they can think to do is just, you know what, we will really take it to people who think that they can get away with what their perception of humiliation is, and more often than not they will just try and take it into their own hands and act as though they are somehow bigger than the law, which we know fine well it isn't. Nobody in their right mind is bigger than the law. But then, even if we're going to become a champion of masculinity, even in this world that seems to be dominated by dominance, if you will, by the richest 0.1% of people on Earth, whether that be your Elon Musks, your Donald Trumps, your Vladimir Putins, etc., etc. However, just because we're under this bizarre illusion that because they're the ones in charge, because they're the ones who have all the money, therefore, regardless of what we think, what they are and what they do, that's got to be the right and correct solution, because you know what, if they manage to get to the very top of the tree, then what difference does it make about who they really are? If they're at the very top, then it must work somewhere. However, and we're going to draw this part 2 of this discussion to an end here, is that yes, well, sadly it may be true that, you know what, they may feel that they are on top of the world. However, nobody stays on top forever. And with that being said, don't fall into that trap either. You may feel as if, you know what, you are absolutely on top of the world, but trust me, the fall will be twice as quick, and you will possibly hit every single branch, boulder, whatever it may be on the way down, and it will be back to reality with a bump. So with that being said, I want to be able to continue this into doing part 3, and if there was a way to describe part 2 more than anything else, is that, well, guess what? It's the outside world is right there, guys, but you know what? The outside world may not be ready for you, but you've got to be ready for it. That's probably the way to bring this together. So, I'll see all of you guys again next time. Thank you.